Chapter 16. Beyond the Gates. Prince Goatee had been wrong about getting their horses through Sallyport. Admittedly it was quite narrow and not all that tall, but Jenni found that if she dismounted and led her horse through, the beast would just about fit. Of the three of them, the prince's horse had the biggest problem getting through the little door. He had chosen one of the larger horses at the royal stables, and it didn't seem too keen on the idea of squeezing through such a small gap. "Come on, you stupid beast," the prince cursed at it. His horse seemed to have gotten itself stuck half in and half out of the city, but there was room all around it. It simply refused to budge. The delay made Jenni nervous. She couldn't help but watch the skies. It would only take one harpy to notice their predicament, and all could be lost. To be fair, the rain wasn't doing a lot to improve her mood either. It was raining outside the city. It was quite a downpour that turned the ground into mushy mud. The weather inside the city had been that of bright warm sunshine, and it had been so since she had woken up this morning. Inside the city it was still a lovely day, the ideal circumstances for a royal wedding. The prince also seemed to notice the anomalous weather as he worked on teasing his horse slowly through the door. He glanced up at the sky with a slightly puzzled look on his face for a moment, and then said, "Philide's magic, at a guess." "I guess so," Jenni agreed. "Somehow I can't see Clemper doing something like this for us." "Quite," the prince replied. After what seemed like a small eternity to Jenni, although it could only have been a few minutes at most, the prince managed to convince his horse to take that important step forward. Once that horse had taken the first step, the prince was able to keep up the momentum, and the horse stepped the rest of the way through the door. "I don't like this mud," Alice said. Now that the three of them were outside the city, she remounted her horse, as did both Jenni and Prince Goatee. "We're going to leave hoof prints that even the most inept hunter could find." "Let's hope then that we aren't worth their while," Jenni replied. "Let's get going," the prince insisted. He spurred his horse into action and began to lead the way across the muddy field in a more or less northwesterly direction. The capital city was surrounded by a lot of open land. Most of it was farmland, although the farms weren't actually being worked today. The king had made an official decree that everyone who wanted it should be allowed to take the day off in order to celebrate his son's wedding. Most of the farm workers, being men who didn't actually own the land they worked, were only too keen to take any excuse for a day off. "At least I don't see many harpies out here," Jenni commented. "One or two," Princess Alice said as she pointed to a couple of harpies circling over by the edge of the forest, quite away from where they were heading. By the look of it, they were staking out the King's Highway at the point where the road met the tree line of the surrounding forest. "I'm not too surprised," the prince declared. "I'm sure that harpies aren't too keen on the thought of clashing with the ducal armies that scattered all around the city. My guess is that they'll want to stay behind the city walls until the elves are ready. Then they'll want to attack." Alice glanced again at the harpies flying at the edge of the forest and commented, "I'm not sure. They don't look all that worried to me. I'd be surprised if none of the Duke's armies can see them. Maybe they already know what's happening in the city." "We can hope so," Jenni put in. "Maybe they do," the prince replied. "Maybe we'll find them preparing to march out and engage the enemy." Then he paused for a second before adding, "I can see the banner of Duke Tamblyn just up ahead. We should make for that camp." Duke Tamblyn's army encampment was located just under a mile from the Sallyport. Jenni had heard about encampments like this, but she had never actually seen one first-hand before. She had seen plans in her father's library, though, as to how such an encampment should be set up. There would be one tent for every 2 soldiers. The tents were to be placed side by side, with just enough room between them for a fully laden soldier to be able to pass by without disturbing them. There would also be an open area for off-duty soldiers to gather, play games and chat, and where soldiers in need of extra drilling could also be catered for. The whole camp was to be surrounded by a tall wooden palisade with only one gate in or out. In the case of Duke Tamblyn's encampment, the gate was just wide enough for a cart to pass through unhindered, and judging by the tracks in the mud, at least one cart had passed through these gates since the rains had started. Normally there would be a guard on duty at the gate, even in a locale such as this, where the locals were supposed to be friendly. Had there been a guard on the gate, then it was highly unlikely he would have missed the harpies or the wyverns flying over the city, or gathering in small groups at various places on the city walls. The prince sounded furious as he noticed the lack of a guard. "I'll have someone's head for this. Where's the guard?" "Perhaps he's inside," Jenni suggested. "If they're preparing to move out in force, I hope so, the prince growled. For his sake. The prince spurred his horse to gain a little speed and rode on through the gate, his face red with fury. Jenni had never seen him so angry. She thought he was going to explode. As soon as he passed through the gates of the encampment, his fury seemed to dissolve into nothing. Jenni couldn't be sure, but she thought she saw the prince's eyes glisten slightly red as he fought to hold back a tear. Jenni followed the prince into the encampment with Princess Alice by her side. "Horse and tiger, no!" Jenni exclaimed as she saw what lay beyond. All over the camp, the soldiers of Duke Tamblyn lay dead. Whatever had hit them had done so suddenly, and not a single soldier had been spared. Soldiers had died regardless of what they had been doing. There was a line of bodies outside the captain's tent, perhaps some kind of sick parade. A pair had died in the middle of a game of battle. Others had died while playing some sort of sport. They had all died in the middle of what they were doing. Not one of them had drawn a weapon or tried to offer any kind of defence. At the sight of the carnage, Princess Alice put her hand to her mouth in shock and horror. "There's no sign of any attack," the prince said. "Not a single elf or a harpy corpse amongst them." "What do you think happened?" Jenni asked. "I don't know." The prince dismounted from his horse, with no thought as to where it might wander without him to control it. He walked over to the nearest corpse and began to check him over. There were no wounds. This man wasn't stabbed or shot. "Clobber?" Jenni suggested. "Could be," the prince replied. "Though he's a lot more powerful than I'd ever given him credit for, if he can strike down entire armies at such a distance, without leaving a single mark." Jenni had seen more death today than any young princess had ever hoped to see in her lifetime. Everywhere she looked there was another poor soul who had fallen foul to whatever it was that struck these soldiers down. Do you think we'll find the same thing in the other camps?" "I'm afraid that seems very likely," the prince replied. He picked up a cup from the floor where it had fallen. The soldier must have dropped it when he was struck down. The prince sniffed it tentatively. "What is it?" Jenni asked. "Wine," the prince replied. He poured out the remainder of the fluid in a ruby stream, where it soaked slowly into the ground. Over in one corner of the camp were no less than 8 barrels, brought to the soldiers of the camp earlier that morning from the king's own wine cellar, so that they too could celebrate the wedding of the king's son to Lady Jenni of the Moth. "Do you think it could be poisoned?" Jenni asked. "Almost certainly," the prince replied. He dropped the cup back to the floor, got to his feet and returned to his horse. Jenni couldn't keep the shock out of her voice as she said, 40,000 soldiers struck down just like that. "Clobber planned this whole thing well," the prince commented as he remounted his steed. "He's been planning this for years. First, he arranges for an attack on Duke Arliss. This alerts the other dukes that the roads aren't safe, so that when the wedding comes, they'll insist on travelling with a hefty bodyguard, leaving their homelands less protected from attack," Jenni offered. The prince nodded. Then Clobber arranges to send poisoned wine to the various camps to wipe out anyone who might come to the city's defence. And no one would think it was funny that the king was sending them special wine. "Because of the wedding," Jenni muttered. "Perfect," the prince said, climbing back onto his horse. "Just perfect. Underhanded and evil, but perfect. Can we just go?" Princess Alice said suddenly. She kept her hand about her nose and mouth as if doing so would somehow keep her unsullied. "Yes," Jenni agreed. "We can't stay here. We should go." "You're right," the prince said. "My father is waiting for reinforcements from the dukes to help hold back the tide of the elven invasion. We are going to have to be it." "Don't be silly," Jenni intoned. She grabbed his shoulder, forcing his attention. "There are 3 of us. We wouldn't last 5 minutes against the elves, let alone the harpies." "But my father," the prince protested, "has probably taken refuge in some house by now, and will escape by his own volition as soon as he's able," Jenni assured him. "You think he'd desert the city militia and go hide?" The prince sounded quite scandalised by the suggestion. "No," Jenni said. "I think he would have reached the city militia barracks and found everyone dead. Remember, that wine wasn't just going to the ducal camps. The only soldiers that would have been spared from this are those on duty. How long do you think it would have taken the harpies to deal with a few dozen guards?" For a moment the prince looked stricken, and then he nodded his head slowly. "We need to head north then. For now we need to keep ahead of the invasion. Duke Borton's territory is just to the north of us. We need to go there and alert what remains of his army. Maybe we can prepare a proper defence against this incursion. Maybe in time we'll be able to take back my father's city." "You don't sound confident," Jenny said as she turned her horse and began to ride back to the gates of the encampment. She hadn't heard Princess Alice leave, but Alice was already outside the gates of the encampment waiting for the other two to join her. "I don't feel confident," the prince replied as he spurred his horse to follow her. Once outside the encampment, the prince took the lead again. Because of the harpies gathered about the tree line where the king's highway penetrated the forest, the prince led the way a little more to the west. "We can cut back to the highway once we get into the forest, so long as we can find a path back," Jenny commented. Jenny and Princess Alice were riding side by side behind the prince. Occasionally, Jenny would glance towards the princess, but the other didn't even look in her direction. She just stared at her brother's back, one hand on the reins of her mount, the other covering her mouth, still in shock at what she had seen at the camp. Once into the forest, they had to ride in single file. There was no actual path, but the prince was able to thread his way fairly well between the trees. Sometimes they had to duck to avoid a low branch of a tree. More than once they had to retrace their steps because the foliage of the forest just got too heavy for them to be able to continue any further. There was also an occasion where they had to dismount in order to get any further. Eventually, the prince found a narrow dirt track that intersected the forest east to west. It was the sort of dirt track that would lead to one of the neighbouring villages. He turned east along the track and led the way back to the king's highway. Jenny kept her eyes on the sky as she followed her husband, only too aware that he was doing likewise. This road was a lot more exposed and struggling through the thick undergrowth of the forest had been, and Jenny couldn't be sure if they were clear of the danger zone or not yet. "Harpies hunt by sound as much as sight," the prince reminded them as they got closer to the king's highway. "No one speak, and try to make as little noise as possible until we were a long way past." Fortunately, the journey remained uneventful as they reached the king's highway. The prince turned north and continued to lead the way. Jenny glanced behind her back towards the city. There were harpies in the air all over the city. A few of them were carrying prey back to the harbour, but others seemed to be just flying about as if the merest sensation of being able to fly brought them pleasure. Jenny's main concern had been for the harpies at the tree line, unsure of just how far north they had gotten in their trek through the forest. She could see no sign of them. The road was long, but it could hardly be described as straight. It took sudden turns in order to incorporate many of the nearest villages, and indeed, more than once the three royals actually found themselves riding through the very centre of a village, often to the cheers of the peasants living there. "Look!" someone shouted on one occasion. "It's the prince and his young bride!" "And who's the other one?" came a reply. "I don't know," shouted the first voice. "Must be a lady in waiting." Once they were beyond the village, Jenny said to the prince, "We're going to have to find some less conspicuous clothing." "I like my clothes," the prince replied. "So do I," Jenny countered. "But they stand out too much. They mark us for who we are." As they continued on past the village, the rain became little more than a drizzle, and shortly after, it stopped. The lands always seemed to smell so fresh after it had been raining, as if all the dust and dirt had been washed out of the air. The road continued generally to the north. It passed through more forests, more farmland, and over a few shallow hills. This was a beautiful land. Jenny felt herself enchanted as she looked at the beauty surrounding her. As they reached the edge of yet another forest, Jenny saw a pair of fox cubs playing until the sound of the approaching horses scared them away. There were deer keeping a close eye on the three as they rode past. It was terrible to think that before too long the elves would be in total control of everything, unless they were somehow stopped. "I wish we had something to eat," Princess Alice suddenly piped up. "Me too," Jenny agreed. "I didn't get much at the feast." "If there's an inn or a tavern in the next village," the prince suggested, "maybe we can stop and grab a bite or two." "With what money?" Jenny asked. Money was one thing she hadn't expected to need today. What little money she had was still sitting on a table in her bedchamber back in the palace. "Both you and Alice are wearing a nice selection of jewellery," the prince pointed out. "I'm sure we can sell or swap one of them for some food. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a few coins into the bargain." The city of Lufton sat on the southern edge of the dukedom of Borton. It was approximately 50 miles to the north of Firstown. Lufton was a very large city. Admittedly, it was only about half the size of the capital, but it was much larger than any other city in the kingdom, with the exception of Borton City. By comparison, Lamington was little more than a glorified village. The city of Lufton was the major nexus point of the country. The King's Highway ran straight through the centre of the city, becoming what was known as the King's Eastern Highway once it reached the gates to the north. About midway through the city, it split into three parts, with the King's Western Highway leaving the city through the western gate and the coastal road leaving through the eastern gate. The country had fallen into the half-light of dusk as the three approached the city. The rain had stopped falling a fair time earlier, leaving them with one of the most attractive sunsets Jenni could ever remember seeing. The gates of the city were wide open and inviting to all. Beyond the gates, the street seemed to be alive with celebration. People were dancing, eating and drinking in the streets. Some were singing, some playing instruments. All in joy at the marriage of the heir to the throne and his beloved bride. After all the death Jenni had witnessed this day, such celebration almost seemed to her to be in very bad taste. She had to remind herself that the people of this city couldn't know what was happening in First Town. There were 2 guards on duty at the gates, as was usually the case in most cities of Floth. They wore the livery of Duke Borton, absolute proof to Jenni that they had indeed crossed the border into the Duke Borton's land. The 2 soldiers were standing casually to attention. Neither of them so much as glanced at any of the 3 approaching riders. The prince yawned loudly as they got closer to the gates. Jenni agreed with his sentiment. It was still relatively early, but it had been a long day, and she too was feeling very tired. The horses seemed to be on the verge of exhaustion and were panting white foam. Jenni and Princess Alice didn't stop. They rode straight through the gate and into the city. The prince had other ideas. He rode up to the nearest of the 2 guards. "Soldier, where can I find your captain of the watch?" The guard looked casually at the prince. "My captain, sir?" Then he seemed up a little more rigid to attention. Perhaps it was something about the way the prince was dressed. The guard definitely sounded quite worried as he asked, "Is something wrong?" "Don't worry, it's nothing either of you 2 have done," the prince assured the guard. "Glad to hear it, sir," the guard replied. "You'll find him in his barracks at the office." He pointed the way to the barracks. "It's the first building on the right, just as you pass through the gate." "Thank you," the prince replied. Then he turned his horse and followed the 2 girls through the gate and into the city. "You should go and find this captain," Jenni said. "Give him the heads up on what's happening at First Town, and warn him that the elves will probably reach at least this far sometime tomorrow." "I will," the prince assured her. "You and Alice should find us a room for the night somewhere. There's a nice inn near the centre of the city called the King's Rest. Go there and I'll find you." It was a nice room. Considering it had cost Jenni both of her pearl earrings, it had better have been a nice room. It was almost a suite. There was a small living space where the guests could gather and chat, and there was a large lead lattice window looking out onto the street below. During the day that looked as if it would let in a lot of light, but this time of night they had to make do with candles. As well as the living space, there were 2 bedrooms. One contained a double bed and the other had a pair of single beds. This was clearly a room intended for a family. Jenni and Alice had been in the room for less than an hour when Prince Goatee joined them. From his demeanour, it was clear he wasn't too happy. Princess Alice looked up as he entered. She then tucked her head back in her hands. It was obvious she had something on her mind, and after the events of the day, who could blame her? "What happened?" Jenni asked. The prince shook his head sadly. "They wouldn't listen. I warned them about the elves and the attack on First Town. I even told them that Duke Borton and his entire family were dead. They thought it was a joke." "A joke?" Jenni said incredulously. "How?" "It's the day," the prince explained. "Apparently it's common practice to play jokes on the militia during events such as this, and they thought my claim was just another joke. They assured me that the elves weren't capable of taking First Town, especially not on a day like today, when there is a huge army sitting just outside the gates." "Did you tell them about the poison?" Jenni asked. "I did," the prince replied. "Well, I tried. They refused to believe that the king could have chosen a traitor for one of his mage advisors." "You should have insisted on talking to his commanding officer," Jenni commented. "I did," the prince told her, "and they threatened to lock me out for the night if I didn't go. So I left." Alice shook her head sadly. "There's nothing we can do. We'll get the same story wherever we go, and by the time the people realise we were right, it will be too late." "All is not lost," the prince said. "One of the captain's lieutenants wanted to take precautions just in case I was telling the truth. He was shot down by his commanding officer, but with any luck, at least one man is taking the threat seriously. One man won't be enough to stem the attack." "We should head to Borton City tomorrow," Jenni suggested. "We might have better luck there." "Maybe," the prince commented. "I'd prefer to stay and fight." "It won't be much of a fight if the gates are left wide open. We need to find a way to convince the leaders here." "How?" Alice asked. "We'll go to the Duke," Jenni suggested keenly. "We ride to Borton as planned tomorrow. The Duke will recognise Prince Goatee, and that will be that. We'll tell him to send a rider back to Lufton, and the troops here will be ready when the elves attack." "Assuming the elves don't come immediately," Goatee stated. "They'll need time to—" Jenni started. Duke Borton was at the feast, Alice pointed out. He's dead. Well, there must be someone, Jenny remarked. I didn't see his knight champion Braystock at the feast. He might be amenable, the prince suggested. He doesn't have the authority, Alice said. But surely we have the heir to the throne with us, Jenny replied. It's worth a try, Prince Gautier agreed. At least Borton will be ready, even if Lufton isn't warned in time. Something else we have to consider. You and Alice might be the last two members of the royal family. 3, the prince interjected. I was thinking that your father might not have made it, Jenny explained. And I was counting you, Gautier responded. Jenny hesitated. Even married to the prince, she still didn't consider herself as a royal. Anyway, the elves will be looking for you. For us. I'm sure we'll be secure behind the closed gates of Borton, but I think we should consider hiding. I'm a prince of the realm, Gautier insisted. I'll be on the city ramparts doing my bit to fend off the attackers. I'm not going to hide. Jenny nodded. And I shall be on the ramparts with you. You won't, the prince threw back. I can use a sword, Jenny told him. I was trained by the best, and I refuse to sit in some lonely room while the battle rages, waiting to hear that my husband is dead, waiting for the elves to find me, rape me, and kill me. The prince didn't seem too happy with the idea. He didn't argue, though. Instead, he yawned and walked over to the 2 bedrooms. I'm too tired to worry about such things right now. I'm going to turn in for the night. Which one is ours? The one to the left, Jenny replied. The one with the double bed. The prince ducked into the room to the left. Jenny got up from her chair and walked to the room in question. But before she got there, she turned to face Princess Alice. Well, I guess we're heading to bed now. You should probably do the same. We need to be gone as soon as we can tomorrow. Princess Alice scowled at Jenny for a moment and nodded. I think I'll just sit here for the night. Alice? Jenny said worriedly. The princess looked at Jenny for a moment and said, We both know that if I go to sleep tonight, the sausage will get me. Then she put her head back in her hands. My only chance is to let the sausage pass through my system before I sleep. I hope that will work, Jenny said. Me too, Princess Alice replied. Sleep well. Would you like me to sit up with you? Jenny offered. Better not, Princess Alice replied. You need to get some sleep. If you're sure, Jenny said. She was in 2 minds about entering the bedroom after her husband or returning to the chair beside Alice. Eventually, her tiredness got the better of her. Good night, then. Good night, Alice remarked. Jenny followed the prince into the left-hand bedroom. The room wasn't all that well lit. There was but 1 candle burning on a small dressing table. The prince was already getting undressed for the bed. He had no night things, so he stripped down to his underwear. Jenny stood in the doorway of the bedroom blushing. She was seeing him half naked for the first time. She hadn't fully prepared herself for the experience. What was worse was the thought that she too was going to have to take her clothes off, and that he would be watching. She was married now, and it was right that he be there. Yet she felt so awkward, so embarrassed at the idea. She suddenly had this image of Race standing before her in the prison tower, trying to cover himself from her sight. Once he had stripped to his underwear, the prince slipped into the bed. Then he looked up at Jenny. Going to join me? Yes, Jenny replied. She stepped into the room and forced her hands to overcome her shyness. She began to remove her top. You know, the prince said, lying back and looking up at the ceiling. Jenny thought he was being very gallant in deliberately not looking at her. I had all sorts of plans for us tonight. It is our wedding night after all. But right now I feel far too tired. And after sitting on that horse all day long, I'm not really sure I'm capable. Jenny blushed. She removed the rest of her clothes fairly slowly and climbed into bed beside her husband. It's probably just as well. After the events of the day, I'm not really in the mood. The prince turned his head to look at her. He then kissed her gently on the nose. Good night, sweetheart. Good night, my prince, Jenny replied, kissing him on the lips. Then she turned and blew out the candle.